Hey everyone, and welcome to the Global Journalism Seminars. We would usually be playing you a video right now, but we're having some technical difficulties. So I'm very happy to welcome Natalia and Noah. Take it away.
Thank you for that, Caitlin, and for the heads up as well. Or our audience would be looking at Noah and I, looking at each other quite blankly for the next few minutes. Welcome, Noah, and welcome to our audience as well. As Caitlin pointed out, usually there's a little bit of context, but let's dive straight into it with an explanation from me and, of course, far more detail from Noah. This time, in our Global Journalism Seminar series, we're shining a light on what I think was perhaps the most evocative visually protest that we've seen in many, many years come out from Israel. It was a moment where many journalists from other parts of the world were looking on almost in shock and awe at what was transpiring across the streets of Israel. I will give you a very brief snapshot of what happened, and Noah, of course, will add much more detail to that. Earlier this year, Israelis, and many thousands actually, joined protests across the country against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his plans to tighten controls on the Supreme Court. The criticism, as it was placed, was that this planned overhaul would put completely unnecessary and unwarranted government control over the Supreme Court. It would remove many vital checks that were in place against the political side of governance. And of course, that this could give unchecked power really to the government. The protests grew from something that looked small scale to really massive demonstrations across the country. And what was most interesting was the fact that several other pockets, including the technology universe of many entrepreneurs and even parts of the military, participated in that protest. Joining me today is Noah Landau. She is a face that I don't think needs introduction across the Israeli space, of course. She is part of Haaretz, a newspaper that has been quite outspoken in its criticism and its coverage of that protest. I must underline and say this conversation is not an attempt to simplify an extremely complex geography. Neither it is to weigh the pros and cons of the protest. It is to understand from a journalist's perspective what it's like to cover a public protest of that scale and what it's like to do that when it is almost a state versus people situation. So Noah, thank you very, very much for joining in today. I follow all your tweets and I quickly press translate because you write so wittily that I want to know what is written, but I can't read the language, unfortunately. I want to start with a very basic why question. There's been quite a bit of drama politically in Israel since 2019, or perhaps even further back, Noah. Why was this such a catalytic moment in public consciousness, you think?
Thank you so much, Natalia, for inviting me. I'll be sure to tweet more in English for you. Just a quick background maybe first. So in December, Israel's 37th government was established, led by Benjamin Netanyahu, who came back for his sixth term as a prime minister. And this government is by far the most far-right and the most religious government in the country's history. This is not just my opinion. The Israeli right wing actually calls it the first full right-wing government that they ever had. And one of the first declarations they made, led by the new justice minister, was that they intend to so-called reform the judicial system. So technically, what they want is to change the balance between the three branches of government in a way that gives the executive branch, meaning the government themselves, more control over the judiciary. So, for example, by allowing the government representatives to choose the judges and the parliament to override Supreme Court rulings. So, to understand what this means basically for our system, today the courts, and especially the Supreme Court, is basically the only mechanism we have in Israel to protect human and civil rights against majority rule, meaning the government and parliament. But beyond these technicalities, what they want is to see a more government-friendly court, a more conservative court, less liberal, so that some more nationalistic values triumph democratic ones. For example, prefer the needs of Jewish majority over the rights of non-Jews, such as Palestinian minorities or asylum seekers. So I'm sure this is quite familiar for many of you from other countries like maybe Hungary, Poland, Turkey, India, maybe, countries where conservative leaders are challenging liberal democratic values. But in Israel, we have to remember that this, of course, also sits on a very explosive barrel, as it is, of an ethnic and religious conflict. But what was quite surprising and also optimistic, Natalia, is that Israel's liberal camp really stood up to these plans in a much faster, wider, and stronger voice than we thought originally, covering these events. We were surprised. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis have been taking the streets nonstop for 22 weeks now in a row. This protest movement is definitely the largest we saw in the country's history. I have to say, it's not the progressive camp, it's more of a center-leaning liberal democratic camp, but it is braver and louder than ever before. And for now, although I'm saying this quite cautiously, the government is pretty stuck. The domestic and international pressures that you mentioned as well were so massive that they decided to launch negotiations with the oppositions for now. Many in the protest movement feel like this could just be maybe a political stunt. But for now, these negotiations are still taking place, as well as the demonstrations.
I suppose the next question from the why, Noah, would be the what and the how. Explain to audiences what was at stake for the Israeli population that was watching these purported changes coming into place, because this was part of the agenda as well that the right-wing administration placed before they were coming into power, was it not? A rollback perhaps of pro-LGBTQ legislation, women's rights, minority rights, loosening the rules of engagement for Israeli police and soldiers. What was at stake in public consciousness when this was being discussed?
Yeah, so basically, these kinds of, because as I said, Israel is not the only country going through not the same processes, of course, but similar trends. Of course, they always aim first at three major institutions, which is the judiciary, as we said, academia, and of course, journalism. So anything considered basically a part of a liberal democratic worldview is basically now under attack.
There's also a how to it, Noah. Having watched these public protests in a country like India, for example, it's almost a curve that you can see slowly building. As a journalist, what is it that you saw take place? Did it start off as small-scale conversations online, or was it in person that people started chatting about this, saying, this is not making us comfortable?
So I think what was quite surprising is that it was just this protest movement just exploded at once. It wasn't a slow process at all. People understood the danger right away. I think right when, even before the government was established, when we saw the election results, we knew what it means. And I think most of the protesters, they just immediately understood the danger. But the interesting thing is that they also immediately took the streets. It wasn't something that was, building up gradually online or something of that sort. It was just people just went out to the streets just like spontaneously as a first reaction to the kind of government they saw.
What was your reaction as someone sitting in the newsroom leading your journalists when you saw this happen?
So, I think one of the most interesting effects on journalism is that in time like these, that are seen as so pivotal, journalists as individuals, but also media outlets as organizations, we see that, they're taking a side. Not everyone, but many. And for us at Haaretz, which is in any case Israel's only liberal-leaning national media, it was very clear from the first moment that we actually have a very clear position against this judicial overhaul. And we felt that, this is a battle on the very essence of our most basic values. And, the values that also include journalism, the free press, freedom of expression, etc. So we definitely voice our opinion in editorials and op-eds, but also our news coverage also gives a lot of emphasis to this issue. And we even launched a campaign to support the protest, which basically says in Hebrew, loose translation, democracy doesn't end with elections. And we had a similar campaign in English, which said democracy can die in daylight too, which is a spin-off on the Washington Post slogan, of course. So I think that in general, it's one of these moments when journalists and journalism really can't stand and claim to be objective.
How do you ring fence yourself as an organization and for your journalists in moments like these, Noah? Because that's the thing, especially for local news outlets, when they're covering something that is seen as a state versus people, the first thing, as you say, is to clamp down on journalists, cut off access to the internet, cut off access to video streaming. It's far easier sometimes as an international organization to be looking into something that's happening locally. Were there sort of steps that you took in place to safeguard the institution, to safeguard the journalists who were covering these protests?
So we see that the National Journalists Union is taking also a much more brave or clear stand in front of some of the issues. This government basically, like other governments, is seeking control over what they think is the so-called leftist media. It's one of their main goals, and it threatened, for example, to shut down the public broadcaster, to withdraw government advertising budgets for media outlets. And we saw that the National Union was quite effective in organizing journalist protests and trying to somehow also prevent these measures from happening, which for now is successful.
It's also, and correct me if I'm wrong, similar to the farmer protests that took place in India, leaderless in a sense. There's no one person, position, party that has really led this. As you said, it's quite organic and happened and came off the people. Is that a more tricky terrain to navigate where you're not really speaking to one particular party, or you don't have one space or spot where you can keep checking and verifying?
So you're right, Natalia. This is quite people-led, and there are opposition parties in the parliament that are representing the protest movement, but they themselves are led by what's happening on the ground and not the opposite. So, for example, when they went into negotiations with the coalition, it was, the protest itself, people on the ground, the spirit on the ground that kind of led their position on some of the issues more than they were leading the movement. We definitely see that. But I think it's also interesting that this is not, the protest movement is, of course, it's not one organization led by one person. There isn't even, usually in these things, there are several figures who become like the symbol. There's maybe one or two that are, perceived as leading figures, but there is no several people who are now who became the symbol of this wider protest. It's a lot of different little groups, local groups. It could be even, they have names like Grandmothers for Democracy, or all sorts of different, small groups that are just, following the same general message.
I love that. I'm all for Grandmothers for Democracy. I'm all for grandmothers at any point in time. There's another very clear nuance to this, Noah, which is that, as reports suggest, the changes were not actually spearheaded by the Prime Minister, but by people who were representing some powerful religious groups. How does a journalist and a news organization navigate something that is not just a big issue, but also has a lot of religious overtones to it and can be quite harmful and dangerous for one community, or it could be dangerous for the journalist in question if they're from another community?
It's a great question. So first of all, regarding, the Prime Minister versus other parties, it's a question. I'm sure in other countries, journalists face the same issue when they're trying to do political analysis. whether, the prime minister is an active actor because he actually chose this government, how much responsibility should he have on what, his coalition members are doing and demanding, over, portraying this as some kind of pressure of extremists within the government, and not putting all the responsibility on him. It's a question. I think regarding these religious communities, the protest movement right now is definitely more of a secular one. It is a secular, generally speaking, because you do see liberal religious communities taking also a part in the protest for sure, but the emphasis is that they're more liberal religious. And in the end, this is also a protest regarding the separation of religion and state. So of course it has that kind of angle to it. But also you see that many of the journalists will emphasize over and over that this is not about the religious citizens, but their leaders. So when we see, for example, that there was a lot of discussion around the budget that this government just approved. There was a lot of money that went to religious communities over other communities. And journalists did try to emphasize that this is not criticism against citizens themselves, who of course have needs that need to be met, but the leaders that do not take other considerations also.
This is always an unfair question to ask someone, as we were discussing before we started. It's always a mad and intense day in the newsroom. But were there stories or moments that really stood out when you were covering this protest? Because, there were some days where the images that came out from Israel honestly made journalists in other parts of the world gasp at the size and enormity of what was unfolding on the streets.
Yeah, so of course there were many stories that I think are important, that we published in the past month, but I'm going to paste here in the chat, and maybe someone can put it somewhere else. One story that I think is very relevant to journalists or those who are interested in media. And this is an investigation by our leading investigative reporter, Gidi Weitz. And he just exposed this week how the new army radio head was appointed with the help of one of Netanyahu's main supporters. So now he wants to give that supporter who lobbied for him a broadcast slot. This is really important, because it shows once again how they try to control also the media. And for those who don't know, one of the corruption charges against Netanyahu, who has 3 indictments against him, does involve trying to see control of one of Israel's main news websites. So you see that this is a theme that is quite important, and this story, I think, shows it, and it's fresh from this week.
I was going to ask this question later, but I think it ties in well with the story that you just shared, Noah. As you pointed out earlier, your newspaper has a particular perception in public consciousness. Sometimes it faces a lot of heat because of that. Do you think the events of the last few months have changed public perception or seen strength and trust and confidence grow for your organization because of how fearless your reportage has been, because of how much of a light you've shone on this particular issue?
Interesting. I think that because this is a wider liberal struggle, not necessarily progressive or leftist, that many of the people who support this protest movement are relying on Haaretz for news and information and opinions and analysis regarding the protest. So I think you might be right, but still we still insist on reporting on some of the issues that still upset some of these people. So, Haaretz is one of the things we're very proud of, but make it very, it's quite difficult for us, is that we really want to put a mirror in front of our readers in many cases and reporting, for example, the occupation, it's something that not all the people that are part of this wider protest movement identify with.
Yeah. And again, this is what reports seem to indicate, Noah, which is that the Palestinian citizens of Israel didn't really participate in this particular protest. Perhaps even a perception of, is this protest for all people or people from one side of the river versus the other? Did you experience that? And how did you deal with a topic like that as a journalist?
So that's also a great question, also very advanced, because it's such a internal discussion within Israelis and Palestinians, but very important point, I think, that again, because this is not a progressive protest, but it's a wider camp, it means that it's often criticized, and I'm one of those people who criticize it, for caring more about what we call democracy for Jews than democracy for Palestinians. So for many within Israel's Palestinian population, which is 20%, and also Jews who support them, it's hard to join a movement that claims to fight for democracy, but isn't really fighting against the occupation. There is a group who joins the demonstrations under the slogan, the Anti-Occupation Bloc. They are smaller, for sure, and not always welcome by the larger group, mainly because they carry Palestinian flags, while the main movement took the Israeli flag as its symbol, because it is also afraid to be denounced as unpatriotic by the coalition, or some would say differently, that they want to reclaim patriotism by holding the Israeli flag. But generally speaking, it's a dilemma, which we address quite a lot in the paper, especially our Palestinian writers do. And I personally think that we unfortunately reached a point in which both fights are important, even if it's hard to argue that Israel is actually a functioning liberal democracy when occupying millions, and it is hard. We still need to maintain whatever is left of the liberal institutions that we do have, because without them, I think it would be much harder to fight the occupation as well. So people on the ground will just suffer more. And at the same time, it's also important to remind that larger movement that it cannot focus only on their own threatened privileges and ignore others.
What did you find were the most powerful platforms and mediums that people were sort of accessing news and more importantly, engaging with the news and commenting when this protest was in its in full form, Noah? Because it obviously looked like a much younger generation was out there. Was it social media? I'm assuming it's not Twitter, because that's only us journalists that obsess about it. What was it that that was really pulling out engagement?
Natalia, I just remember that when I was a fellow at the Institute a while ago, we had a great seminar with a Turkish journalist on how social media affected the protest there. And here we are in 2023, and it's still a major question. Yeah, and like everything else with social media, of course, it did both, good and harm. The protest organizers, of course, through groups like WhatsApp. But on the other hand, there's a lot of fake news and misinformation, spread by other groups. So basically, you see in Israel almost every kind of media that exists, if it's WhatsApp and Telegram or Signal even, and all those messaging apps have been very, very, I think, important in the organization of the demonstration. As I mentioned before, we have all these local groups like Grandmothers for Democracy, and they will all organize on WhatsApp. There's also now WhatsApp communities, which is quite interesting. We're trying to figure out as a news organization how we can use it. And I'm not sure what the answer is, but we do see that for the protest movement, it's very effective, because you can kind of like take all these smaller groups and build them into one larger community. Regarding Twitter, although it's not at its best now, I do think that Israelis are quite quite engaged on Twitter, more than I think in other places. I mean, in other places it might be where journalists are, but I think in Israel people understood that this is also where people who want to influence the journalists are. So you see quite a lot of action there. And of course, for younger people, it's TikTok and Instagram mostly.
I'm intrigued by how Haaretz uses social media, and I think you have quite a bit of fun with it. It's quite tongue-in-cheek. I saw a tweet where someone basically likened the newspaper to garbage, and then you had a lot of fun with that, and then actually took it forward saying, garbage doesn't light itself, so we're looking to hire. Would anyone like to apply? Has that been a conscious choice where you've said, bring on the hate, we're happy to deal with it? Or was it something that sort of grew over time, saying, hey, we can either choose to have fun with this and have a laugh at it, or we can choose to do something else?
I think both, but we do really enjoy to experiment every kind of new platform that there is out there. We're very experimental in what we do, and I guess some organization, I think they need to have a very structured plan before they launch an account of something. We like to be more experimental and just dive right in and try things and see what works and what doesn't. We're usually, the first to jump in, at anything that basically is new and happening. Some of the things will just, if something doesn't work, I don't know, I'm thinking about Clubhouse, for example, or these things. We'll always try, and then if it's not really working, then we'll just give it up. But it's something that we just try to experiment with it. So that includes also our tone and our voice on these platforms. We try and see what works.
As a local journalist, Noah, and it's a very broad-based question because there are so many entities that go into it, but what did you feel about the way the protests and the developments were being covered by international media?
I think we saw quite an interest at the beginning, and it's almost a cliche. It is a cliche to say, that when something is international news for others, there's an interest when it starts, and then they just it's left behind. Much more important examples are Syria or Ukraine. These were both stories that were covered so heavily by the media worldwide, and then was a bit forgotten. So I guess we saw that also. But I do see that there's an interest still when important things happen, not all the nuance and all the domestic issues, but there's still quite an interest.
I'm going to pause with my questions because I can see them building across all our platforms, but as is form, I will open the house first to our own journalist fellows. Let me go back into the room, and perhaps the first question could come from Natalia, who is a journalist who belongs to Russia and has been reporting quite critically on developments there. Natalia.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Noah, for this explanation and the opportunity to see your perspective what's going on in Israel. I'm here for research about the role of Russian Orthodox Church in pro-war propaganda campaign. I found that the church played a significant role not only in this particular situation, but in general. It is shaping a new Russian ideology full of isolation, conservatism, nationalism. And my question is about religious institutions in Israel. What do you think, to what extent the religious institutions in Israel provoke this situation, and what was the role of a religious institution in this particular protest?
That's really interesting. Thank you. I'm really looking forward to read your research. It sounds very interesting. As I said, this is one of the most, it is the most religious government we ever had. So of course, religion plays a big part. I think what might be interesting to point out is that in Israel, the ultra-Orthodox parties are basically controlled by the rabbis, the religious leaders of that community. I mean, they directly select their parliament representatives, and they control these parties directly. So definitely there's a lot of involvement, but also maybe interesting that they didn't used to be so much aligned with the right wing necessarily. So in Israel's history, they mostly wanted to join a government that would be good for their sector, meaning that would provide the budgets they need, that will give them autonomy, that kind of relationship. But what we saw in recent years is that they're starting to be more ideological about it, and they're starting to shift. Mostly the younger generation is starting to shift to the right wing ideologically, not just as a way to fulfill their autonomy and budgets.
Perhaps we can move to UC next and then to Radhesham. I'll just wait for a second while the camera pivots, and then UC can pose his question.
Hi there. Yeah, hi, hello. Thank you so much for talking with us today. I was wondering, the attention span of news organization is often not very long, and now the protests have been going on for months. So I was wondering, are you noticing any signs of the Israeli media or the audience getting tired of the situation, or the international media? And if you think there is this type of risk for apathy, how do you think it can be tackled?
Yes, there is definitely a risk. I think now we're actually at a greater risk just because everything is very static at the moment politically, because there are negotiations between the coalition and opposition, but the protests are still, happening, but there isn't a specific plan that they're protesting against, because there's nothing on the table. That we're waiting for the negotiations, basically. We do see that people, are not quite sure if what's happening, and they're less engaged because, again, there's nothing specific on the table. But we do still maintain. So I mean, we will cover all the protests, the bigger protests that happen every Saturday, no matter how many people will be there, no matter what's exactly on the table. We'll just keep doing that as a principle. But I think once the government will try to actually legislate something, then you see again the peak of interest. So people are interested. It's just that the situation is pretty static.
Thank you.
Radhesham, I think, is up next.
Hi, Noah. So you mentioned that journalism can't stand and claim to be objective in certain situations. In this case, how do you distinguish between journalism and activism?
The question that we like the most as journalists. My own perspective is that there is no such a thing as being objective. I don't think you can try to use an objective language, but it doesn't mean that you're objective, because anyone who's reporting on anything has an opinion, whether, if it's emphasized in the reporting or it's not, but you still have a wider point of view, world point of view, a wider political point of view. Of course, we try, we report the facts, but the facts also, they have, there's a perspective behind them. So if we think that, liberal democracy is a better way to live, then, of course, we have an opinion, and it's not something we hide. So the question then is it better to be to present a fake objectiveness to your readers, or you should just put your opinion out there, for example, in editorials, and let your readers know what is your perspective.
There's another question that almost ties into that, Noah. So let me ask you, this is coming from our wider audience. Mahmoud Hashim asks, how many leftist media and movements are there? I assume he means in Israel. And how does the system deal with them?
Well, of course, then you have to ask, how do you define left? Which is an interesting question, I guess, in Israel. But if you look at, I don't know, the classic definition of left, so for example, the only Jewish left-wing party was kicked out of parliament in the last elections. There is no representation for Jewish leftist right now in the parliament at all. In terms of media, I guess most Israelis, if you ask them, just walking in the street, which media outlet in Israel is considered to represent the left, they will all say Haaretz.
In your experience, and I know you've been reporting for many years now, Noah, did you see something like this take place of this scale, or was it a once-in-a-lifetime reportage opportunity?
Never. I mean, this is factual and objective. We never had so many people in the streets. No matter, it doesn't matter for what. They're in terms of not only the amount of people, because we did have several very large demonstrations in the past on other issues, but the amount plus the time plus the energy, all of that together. I mean, we never saw such a movement before.
Tarjei has a question as well. Tarjei, go ahead.
Hi, Tarjei from Norway. You mentioned briefly, but I was wondering if you could elaborate more on this, that this is a very broad protest movement, but with quite little participation from the Palestinian population. Could you tell us a little bit more what you think might be the background for that group in society participating to a lower extent here?
You mean, should I expand on the Palestinian perspective?
Yeah, towards the protests, yes. Why you think is the reason they are not participating so much in this quite broad protest movement?
Well, to put it simply, I think, again, the fact that this is a protest that focuses on Israeli democracy, and democracy, first of all, for Israelis and not for Palestinians, that's the main turnoff. And it's true, because this movement tries to aim to a wider audience as they can. I mean, the protest movement also doesn't want to be perceived as political in the party sense. They don't want to be perceived as right or left. They want to claim that democracy and liberal values are good for the right wing and the left wing, and that everyone should participate because of that. By doing so, they, of course, alienate Palestinians.
In the past, Noah, we've had conversations with journalists who've pointed out that in order to maintain the safety of journalists on the ground or journalists reporting on a particular issue, it's important to build some kind of alliance, even if it's an unspoken, unwritten alliance. There has to be some kind of a safety net in place, particularly when reporting events at large scale. You mentioned very briefly that there was, some talk within the journalist union in Israel, but were there sort of SOPs set in place in terms of how we can support journalists covering the public protest, where it's quite obviously, a state versus protest situation?
Yeah, so we had several serious incidents where our journalists, photographers were hurt by police. There are always complaints that we file, and again, the union is helpful in that, and there's support, after the incident, but still incidents happen, and our journalists and photographers, they face police violence usually in most of these protests, and it is a problem.
Would you have advice or observations to share for some of the smaller media outfits that tend to cover these protests, where you don't always have the scale and resources that you need for your journalists?
Yeah, so forming alliances and unions is definitely one way to do so. And I see, where we have, for example, the photographers are a pretty unite group, and they do help each other also on the ground, not only, raising solidarities afterwards, also even on the ground when they see one of them, that's being treated unfairly by police, they will immediately intervene right there. So I think, of course, if it's possible to form unions, and even very specific unions, for example, for journalists on a local level, for photographers who cover the same area, etc., that's very helpful.
This is often a tricky question to answer, but do you think that were it not for the era of social media, the protests may not have scaled in the way they did? In this particular instance, do you think it worked as a tool and an ally? And, going back to your own experiences when you were a fellow and you probably had the same chat, what was your lived experience here?
So regarding social media, again, it's a blessing and it's a curse. And I think actually messaging apps are more effective in organizing and sharing information more than Facebook. Facebook, I think, is probably not so relevant anymore with all the changes they themselves wanted to do with their algorithms. So political content is much less relevant there. But I think messaging apps are quite important now.
I can see a lot of the questions coming in. They don't seem quite pertinent to the discussion at hand, but let me try and frame this in a way that it makes sense for both. So there's one question saying, how did the political view on the occupation in Palestine change in the Israeli young generations? Did you see a connection between what was happening at this point, Noah, and whether or not the younger generation became more engaged with political topics because of this public protest?
Yeah, it's a painful question, because in many liberal democracies, younger people are more progressive. They support causes like climate and LGBT, etc. And in Israel, actually, what we saw in recent elections is that it's the opposite. The younger the voter was, the more they leaned to vote for the most extreme far-right party that we have in this government. So it looks like the trend in Israel and the Jewish population is different.
How is Haaretz choosing to engage with a younger generation? I imagine, just like India, it's a younger generation, but it has very strong political views. Have you, thought deeply about how to engage with this generation?
Yeah, so of course, like every media outlet, we try to aim also at younger readers. I think we see young, it also depends how you define younger, right? But we do have a TikTok account. We do try to do more explainers, which we think is a great way to approach information journalism, and we do that in terms of video, but it's not that different from what others are trying to do to reach a younger audience, really.
And I heard you say earlier that there was quite a bit by way of misinformation and disinformation. Did you have to almost divide your newsroom into sort of sections and heads saying, okay, the four of you need to really counter all the misinformation coming in? Or was it, more or less already a structure that exists in the newsroom, but was just working harder?
So there's always a dilemma between being fast and being correct. We always try to find, the perfect balance, which doesn't exist, between being the first, but also making sure that we actually verify everything before we just press the notification button. So that's a struggle, and there's no simple answer. But fortunately, with a lot of the very blunt fake news that's running around, usually it's quite clear, that it's that at least that there's a question mark there. Usually it's quite clear. But also when I say, when I talk about fake news, it's not only, stuff that, are spread on WhatsApp or on other social media. It's also, an official television network that describes itself as pro-Netanyahu and would broadcast, kind of like the Israeli Fox News, they would also broadcast things that, are just not true.
I know we're running out of time. So one final question, Noah, before we let you go, and I know you're running busy as well. For independent journalists watching this and, wanting to cover protests like this, I know it's different for you because there is an ecosystem of a newsroom that exists. But what would you say are the sort of top 2 or 3 or 4 takeaways in terms of how to report this in a responsible fashion?
Actually, for independent journalists, protests like that are a major opportunity to shine, and we do see that there are several independent journalists in Israel that are focusing only on the protest movement, sharing information only through social media accounts. And the more you build your reputation as someone who's worth following because you're there on the ground, bringing in all the information from the actual protests, and if you build a reputation that the information you provide is usually accurate, then actually it's a very good opportunity for independent journalists.
What's next for Haaretz? What can we look out for in terms of your reportage? Are there sort of new areas that you're exploring, particularly with, as you said, shining a light and continuing to shine a light on the protests?
Well, we've been for 104 years now, almost 105 years. We've been covering, mostly the same issues. We are paper of record, but we do have new issues that we focus on from time to time. For example, like a lot of other newsrooms, we have a desk that specializes in climate change. And we are always talking about whether the new communities, new areas of coverage that we should focus on. So, we still do what we do, and we add some of the new fields as they come.
Fantastic stuff. And it's, as I said, it's always interesting and engaging to see how you work with your audiences. Noah, thank you very much for joining in. Thank you for taking on all these questions very gamely. And we wish you all the luck with this and with everything else that Haaretz continues to do. Thank you very much. And to our audience as well. We'll see you again next week.